Well, we face a very serious dilemma, stark, cruel dilemma. On the one hand, there is a severe, dire crisis. Dealing with it cannot be delayed. It's the most important issue that has arisen in human history. This generation, in fact, today's leaders and people will make a decision as to whether organized human society can survive in any decent, livable form. It's no less than that. We are facing a very serious crisis, the most significant one that has arisen in human history. The decent existence of future generations is very much at stake, and we have the responsibility of determining whether they will have a livable existence or not. It's as serious as that. There are ways to address the problem. We have to think about them carefully, work out the proper ways of dealing with them, act decisively, energetically, and urgently to address this impending dramatic crisis. That's one horn of the dilemma. The other horn of the dilemma is that we have to face the reality of the world. We have to find ways of reacting that are not only justified, but are also feasible and effective. So, for example, it would be entirely justified to send the most powerful person in the world, President of the United States, to The Hague for trial for severe crimes against humanity, and many lesser figures as well. That would be justified. It's not feasible. It's not effective. To deal with, to choose approaches that are feasible and effective, we have to recognize the reality of the situation we face and adjust our approaches accordingly. So when the President of the United States says, I don't believe it, highly intelligent people like myself are not believers, that has an impact on much of the population, especially so when it is echoed by the people right in the next lower level. So, for example, if you look at the Republican Party primaries in 2016, every single candidate either denied that global warming is taking place or said maybe it is, but we shouldn't do anything about it, which morally speaking is much worse. They were incidentally the ones praised as the adults in the room. Or we can go on to corporate executives. So I'm sure that the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon, is well aware of the effect of using fossil fuels freely. So how is he deciding to react to that? By increasing investment in fossil fuels. We know very well about the behavior of the major fossil fuel companies over the past 40 or 50 years. It's now well known that their scientists, ExxonMobil's scientists, were in the lead in discovering the significance and the threat of catastrophic environmental global change, and were presenting paper after paper to their own managers and executives, explaining the nature of the threat. And when James Hansen in 1988 made his famous speech warning the world of the threat that we are facing, ExxonMobil management reacted, namely by shifting to funding of denialism and skepticism and increasing their use of fossil fuels. When the New York Times a couple of weeks ago runs a long front page, 1,000-word article on how President Trump is opening up vast new fields in the west of the United States for oil exploration, for fracking. They do talk a little about environmental effects, namely it might harm the interests of ranchers who want to use those lands. It was literally one phrase in 1,000 words saying that by dropping restrictions on methane, it may lead to a very dangerous gas escaping into the environment. One phrase in 1,000 words. And we can continue. And all of this has an effect on the population. People listen, they see that nobody seems to be taking it seriously. We see the results in polls among Republicans. Fully half of Republicans literally deny that global warming is taking place. Now, that includes people whose livelihoods are being destroyed by long droughts that are wiping out their sources of fish, of food, and so on. Say, no, it's not happening. That's half of Republicans. Of the other half, barely half say humans may be responsible. After all, if the man in charge says highly intelligent people like me don't believe it, who am I to question it? These are some of the realities we have to face. We also have to recognize that the approach is not the effective approach, is not simply to say, look, there's a dire emergency, you have to change everything you do. That's not going to work. What has to be done is to approach people explaining that the situation is serious, is likely to be catastrophic unless we do something, and then go on to show what in fact is true, that efforts to deal with it are within range and will in fact make your life better. They're not going to destroy your life. We'd be much better off living in a green economy. You'd be much better off not spending 3 hours a day fighting traffic jams. If you had an efficient mass transportation system, you'd be better off if you didn't have to take your kids to the doctor because they're suffering asthma because they can't breathe the air. If we had potable water, yes, things would be better. If we had an environment in which people could survive and live decent lives, everyone would be better, and it is within reach. There are things that we can do. There are things that are being done. Those are the kinds of approaches that have to be taken, and it has to be done. It's a difficult choice because on the one hand, you recognize the enormous character of the catastrophe that's impending. On the other hand, you have to mute your responses to address the reality of the world in which you're trying to make a change. This is a hard decision. Often in many activist endeavors, these questions arise, and it simply has to be, it has to be managed and quickly. Some of the things that are happening are almost beyond description. I'll just mention what may be the most evil document that has ever appeared in human history, which was barely mentioned in the news. Naturally, it's from a bureaucracy, Trump's National Highway Administration bureaucracy. Came out with a big study, a couple 100 pages, explaining why all regulations on automotive emissions have to be ended. No regulations, free emissions. And they had a very rational argument. They said, if we extrapolate from what is happening now, by the end of the century, it will essentially be over the cliff. The temperature will have risen 3 or 4 degrees centigrade. Sea level will be very high. They radically underestimated it. People will be fleeing the coastal zones. It's all over. And emissions don't really contribute that much to it, so why not enjoy it while we can? The underlying assumption, of course, is everyone in the world is as criminally insane as we are, and nobody's going to do anything about it. That's the human species. So fine, let's rob while the planet burns, putting poor Nero in the shadows. He only fiddled while Rome burns. That's the world that we face, and we have to understand it, deal with it, grit our teeth, approach the problems constructively, effectively, and in a way that is feasible, suppressing the justified feeling that we should be taking extremely dire actions. Now, that is not to say that we should not be doing those things. Major dramatic actions are very much in order. Efforts to create a general strike, regular massive protests, all of these things are important. They have to be shaped and geared so that they, instead of being offensive to people, they energize and mobilize them. That's the way they have to be developed, organized, and run. There's a range of activities that can be important, that can be done, from talking to your neighbor to installing LED lights to political action to demonstrating to bringing the dire character of the existing circumstances to general understanding. All of these things are within range. There can be no delay in executing them. These are the most significant questions that the human species has ever faced. We have to face them now. We cannot wait. Individuals can do only so much, something, but not much. Organized groups can achieve a great deal. We see that from the history of popular movements that have succeeded. So take, say, the American Civil Rights Movement. In 1960, a few Black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, decided to sit in at a lunch counter and ask to be served. They were arrested, taken away. That could have been the end, except the next day some more came. They were arrested, taken away. And pretty soon you had freedom riders riding in buses throughout the South in extremely dangerous conditions, trying to convince poor Black people that they had the right to vote. That's dangerous. They could be killed. Young white students from the South started coming down, and several were indeed killed. Pretty soon you had a mass organization, huge demonstrations. Martin Luther King led an enormous demonstration in Washington, finally led to the passage of limited but significant civil rights legislation. Same thing happened with the anti-war movement. I mean, I can remember myself when John F. Kennedy sharply escalated the war in 1961 and 62, sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, authorized chemical warfare programs to destroy crops and livestock, began programs to drive ultimately millions of people into what amounted to concentration camps and urban slums. No protest, no comment, barely reporting. The few of us who were concerned were doing things literally, like talking to a group of people in somebody's living room, or maybe a church with half a dozen people or something like that. It built up. Many people got involved. Others became organized. Pretty soon you had resistance groups. By 1967, there was a mass popular movement. Now, there's reasonable evidence that the huge demonstrations in Washington may well have prevented President Nixon from using nuclear weapons, which were being contemplated. It was too late, wasn't enough to save the country from destruction, but it did help terminate the disaster in time for at least survival. Could have been much worse. And it extended. By the early 1980s, there were mass popular movements, a large majority of the population, demanding an end to the lunatic nuclear weapons race, which was literally on the verge of destroying us. Had some effects, not enough, but some. That's the way movements develop. You can begin as an individual. You have to work with others. You have to talk to your neighbors. You have to join with others. And the record shows that it can succeed. We don't have a lot of time. This has to be done effectively, quickly, with careful thought. Actions like Extinction Rebellion, the teacher strike, earth strike, aiming for a general strike. All of these things can be in parallel with efforts to simply introduce legislation to improve renewable energy, to cut back sharply on the use of fossil fuels, to end the insane expansion of fossil fuel exploration and lifting of destructive fuels. All of that has to be done at the same time. During the Vietnam War, there were serious efforts by distinguished international lawyers, lay figures who joined in, arguing correctly that the U.S. war in Vietnam was a criminal act, that it was in violation of the basic principles of international law, even of the U.S. Constitution. There were strong arguments. There was no chance in the world that they would reach a court. If any court even looked at them, they would say right away, political issue, I don't touch it. But these had important educational impact. It helped people understand the nature of this criminal endeavor. The same would be true of dramatic efforts to bring major figures who are carrying out huge crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court, which is authorized to try crimes against humanity. There is no greater crime that can be imagined than moving expeditiously in a dedicated effort to undermine the possibilities for organized human life in order to stuff some more dollars into overstuffed pockets. We want to rob right now. As I say, that's criminality of a kind that you can't really find in human history. There have been plenty of monsters in the past. Attila the Hun, Hitler, Stalin, you can name many of them, but none were dedicated to trying to destroy, consciously, to destroy the prospects for organized, decent human life in the near future. And no one ever committed themselves to that. And that can be brought to people's understanding. No one's going to be brought to the Hague, but recognizing that it would be legitimate and justified is an important way of helping people comprehend the enormity of what is happening before their eyes. Bolsonaro is one of the most dangerous figures to appear in the international political arena in many respects. And the Amazon is a source of survival for the entire world. It's one of the main carbon sinks in the world. If he pursues his announced objectives to opening up the Amazon still further to exploitation by agribusiness and mining, that's almost a death knell to the world. And of course, it's a call for genocide for the indigenous population, which he has virtually declared, in fact, saying they don't deserve a square centimeter. But we don't have to go to the most evil creatures in the world. Let's go to the civilized countries. So take, say, right to the north of the United States. Canada regards itself and is regarded as one of the most civilized countries in the world. What are they doing? They happen to be one of the leading polluters, way up ranked at the top. Not only just producing fossil fuels, but insisting on the most dangerous of them, the tar sands in Alberta. Canadian mining corporations are the scourge of the earth. They're destroying places all over the global south. That's the civilized countries. Australia, another civilized country, is practically backing out of any pretense of dealing with the extraordinary threat of climate change. And we can continue. There are others. There are plenty who are doing serious, good things. Denmark is making serious efforts. States in the United States, localities, are doing important things. China, which continues to develop coal plants, which is criminal, is also well in the lead in producing solar panels, even the most high-tech. So there is a mixture, but the level of criminality is overall is just shocking when we consider what is at stake. We should always bear in mind the slogan that Antonio Gramsci made famous. We should have pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. It's never been more important than it is now.